Picture this, it's December 1941. Pearl Harbor is still smoldering. The United States has just been dragged kicking and screaming into the worst war in human history. But here's the thing that nobody tells you. While Europe was being turned into a graveyard and Asia was drowning in blood, American GDP didn't collapse. It didn't stagnate, it exploded. By the time the smoke cleared in 1945, the United States held 50% of the world's entire economic output. 50%, one nation, half the planet's wealth. But here's the question that should keep you awake at night. Was that dominance earned through sacrifice and heroism, or was it the greatest profiteering scheme in human history? Because if you actually follow the money, if you track the gold flows and the Lend-Lease contracts and the quiet meetings in New Hampshire hotels, you start to realize something deeply uncomfortable. America didn't just win World War II, it sold the war to both sides. Waited for everyone else to bleed out, and then walked in at the last minute to collect the trophy. And that move, that ruthless, calculated decision to let the world destroy itself while American factories ran at full capacity. That's the skeleton key to understanding every geopolitical move the United States has made for the last 80 years. The dollar dominance, the military spending, the 800 overseas bases, the oil wars, all of it traces back to a single moment. When America looked at a burning world and saw opportunity, so let me ask you this. When your entire global position is built on the ashes of other people's cities, what happens when those cities rebuild? What happens when the world stops needing your dollars, your military, your permission? That number I mentioned earlier, 50%, we need to come back to that. Because by the end of this video, you're going to understand why that number is the most dangerous thing in American history. But first, we need to rewind, because the story of how America became a superpower doesn't start in 1945. It starts in the dirt. Let's talk about the cheat code. If you've ever played a strategy game like Civilization or Risk, you know the most important decision you make isn't your technology tree or your military strategy, it's where you spawn. And the United States spawned in the most broken, overpowered location on the map. I'm not talking about freedom or the Constitution or the American spirit. I'm talking about raw geographic brutality that no other nation on Earth can replicate. Start with defense. The United States sits between two massive oceans. The Atlantic is 3,000 miles wide, the Pacific is 6,000. That's not a border, that's a moat the size of a continent. While France and Germany spent 1,000 years slaughtering each other because they share a flat piece of land, the United States developed in near-total safety, no land invasions. No castle walls, no need to park half your economy on the border just to survive the winter. But here's where it gets obscene, the Mississippi River Basin. This isn't just some scenic waterway, it's the largest network of navigable rivers in the world. 14,000 miles of rivers and tributaries that you can float a barge down from Montana to the Gulf of Mexico. Why does that matter? Because moving stuff by water is cheap. A farmer in Iowa can float his corn to New Orleans for pennies. A farmer in Russia has to haul his grain over frozen dirt roads through the Urals. By the time his crops reach the port, they cost 3 times as much. This river system gave America an internal economic advantage before it even started trading with the rest of the world. It created a capital surplus that no European power could match. And then there's the land itself. The Midwest is the largest stretch of high-quality farmland on the planet. Flat, fertile, temperate, it's essentially a breadbasket the size of Europe. But it's not just food. The United States sits on massive deposits of coal, iron, copper, oil, and natural gas. Britain had to colonize India and Africa to get resources. Japan had to invade China for oil. The United States had everything in its backyard. It didn't need an empire to function. It was an empire in a box. Now I know what you're thinking. This land wasn't empty. You're right. This geographic advantage was secured through systematic genocide and a war of conquest against Mexico. The United States didn't discover this paradise, it took it. But from a cold, strategic perspective, the result was the same. By 1900, America had achieved something called strategic depth. Endless resources, impenetrable borders, free internal shipping. While Europe was a knife fight in a phone booth, America was sitting in a fortress made of gold and corn. But geography alone doesn't make you a superpower. You need a catalyst. You need a moment when everyone else stumbles and you're the only one left standing. And in 1914, Europe handed America that moment on a silver platter. The year is 1914. Europe decides to commit collective suicide. This is World War I. And here's what they don't teach you in high school. Before the war started, the United States was a debtor nation. That means American businesses owed more money to Europe than Europe owed to us. Wall Street was basically a branch office of London. The real power was across the Atlantic. Then the shooting started. Britain and France needed supplies, bullets, shells, wheat, steel. And because their factories were being shelled into rubble, they couldn't make it themselves, so they called America. And American industry said yes. Exports to Europe went from $2.4 billion in 1914 to $5.7 billion by 1916. Companies like DuPont, the chemical giant, produced 40% of all the gunpowder used by the Allies. Their stock price went up 355% during the war. But here's where it gets really dirty. Britain and France ran out of money pretty fast. They'd spent all their gold buying American explosives. So how do you keep buying weapons when you're broke? You borrow. And who did they borrow from? J.P. Morgan. The House of Morgan became the sole purchasing agent for the British government in the United States. They organized massive loan syndicates. By the time the war ended in 1918, Europe owed the United States $10 billion. Adjusted for the size of the economy, that's a staggering, economy-warping amount of money. The script had flipped. New York replaced London as the financial capital of the world, and here's the kicker. The United States didn't even join the fighting until 1917, 3 years late. Think about that. Europe spent 3 years grinding itself into paste. Meanwhile, America sat on the sidelines, selling weapons to both sides through neutral channels, upgrading its factories, and lending money at interest. Finally entered the war, it was fresh, rich, and industrialized beyond anything Europe could match. This wasn't heroism. This was opportunism on a scale that would make a mob boss blush. The money that flowed into America during World War I is what funded the Roaring Twenties. That whole Great Gatsby era of jazz and flappers and stock market speculation, that was built on British and French debt payments. But there was a darker side. The United States refused to act like a responsible creditor. It demanded every penny back, but it put up tariffs that made it impossible for Europe to sell goods to America. This economic strangulation helped trigger the Great Depression and fed the rise of fascism in Germany. But from a raw power perspective, the damage was already done. America had overtaken Europe financially. The torch had passed. Still wasn't a military giant. In the 1930s, the American army ranked somewhere near Portugal in size. It was tiny. To become the true hegemon, to become the unchallengeable superpower, America needed one more catastrophe, and it got one. If World War I was the warm-up, World War II was the main event. This is the moment the United States didn't just become rich, it became a god-tier economic entity. The year is 1939. War breaks out in Europe again. By 1941, Hitler controls the continent. Japan is rampaging across the Pacific, and the United States is still technically neutral, still shaking off the Great Depression. Then Pearl Harbor happens, and what followed was the most insane explosion of industrial output in human history. I need you to really visualize these numbers because they don't feel real. President Franklin Roosevelt set a target of producing 50,000 aircraft per year. His advisors told him it was impossible. By 1944, the United States was cranking out 96,000 planes a year. Ford Motor Company built a factory called Willow Run. It was a mile long. At peak production, this single factory was spitting out one B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. In the time it takes you to watch a movie, Ford built a flying fortress capable of leveling a city. Had produced 300,000 aircraft. 86,000 tanks, 2.6 million machine guns, and enough ships to make the Navy bigger than every other navy on Earth combined. And just like in World War I, America supplied the Allies, Britain, the Soviet Union, China. We sent them $50 billion worth of equipment through a program called Lend-Lease. That's about $700 billion in today's money. We sent 400,000 jeeps and trucks to the Soviet Union alone. Joseph Stalin himself admitted later that without American machines, the USSR would have lost. But here's the cynical part. Lend-Lease wasn't charity, it was leverage. Made the entire Allied war effort dependent on American factories. And while American factories were running 24/7, glowing with efficiency, everyone else's factories were being bombed into dust. Germany's industrial base destroyed, Japan's incinerated. Britain's bankrupt and cratered, the Soviet Union's gutted by invasion. When the smoke cleared in 1945, the United States was the only major industrial power left standing with its infrastructure intact. Held 2/3 of the world's gold reserves. Produced 60% of the world's manufactured goods. Was the only country with the atomic bomb. The world had been leveled, and America was the construction company, the bank, and the police force all in one. But here's the thing, military dominance wasn't enough. Needed to make sure it stayed on top forever, it needed to rig the system. And that brings us to a boring little hotel in the mountains of New Hampshire, where the future of money was decided in secret. It's July 1944. The war in Europe is still raging, but the outcome is no longer in doubt. The Allies are going to win. So the United States invites delegates from 44 countries to a resort called Bretton Woods to decide how the global economy is going to work after the war ends. This was the ultimate power move. The British sent John Maynard Keynes, the most famous economist in the world. He proposed a neutral global currency that wouldn't favor any one nation. The Americans sent a Treasury official named Harry Dexter White, and White looked at Keynes and basically said, "We have all the gold, so we're doing it my way." And his way became the Bretton Woods Agreement. Here's how it worked. The dollar would be pegged to gold at $35 an ounce. Do you understand what this means? The dollar became the official reserve currency of the planet. If France wanted to buy oil from the Middle East, they couldn't pay in francs, they needed dollars. If Japan wanted to import steel, they needed dollars. This gave the United States what economists call exorbitant privilege. America could print green pieces of paper and exchange them for real goods, cars, oil, electronics from the rest of the world. Every other country had to actually produce something valuable and sell it to earn those dollars. It was like showing up to a poker game where you're the only person allowed to print your own chips in the bathroom. And to enforce the system, they created two organizations: the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Officially, these institutions exist to stabilize economies and fund development. Unofficially, they were designed to ensure that poor countries stayed open to American business and that Europe remained dependent on American loans. The trap was set. The world was now financially addicted to Washington. But there was still a problem. Europe was a pile of rubble. And a pile of rubble doesn't buy Fords or Coca-Cola. By 1947, Europeans were starving. People in the Netherlands were eating tulip bulbs. In France and Italy, communist parties were gaining massive popular support. The Soviet Union looked at this desperation and saw opportunity. If Western Europe went communist, the United States would lose its biggest export market and its buffer against Stalin. Launched the Marshall Plan, $13 billion in aid to rebuild Western Europe. That's about $150 billion today. History books call this the most generous act in modern history. Look how kind America is, but let's read the fine print. The aid came with conditions. A huge portion of the money had to be spent buying goods from the United States. It was a brilliant laundering scheme. Government taxes American citizens. It gives that money to France. France uses the money to buy tractors and steal from American corporations. The money flows right back into American pockets. It was a stimulus package for General Motors disguised as charity. More importantly, it bought loyalty. Any country that took Marshall Plan money agreed to align its trade policies with Washington. And keep communists out of power, it cemented the Iron Curtain. Western Europe became an economic client state. Eastern Europe fell to Stalin. And the United States owned the rich half. So the Nazis are defeated, peace on earth, right, wrong. The United States had a problem. Its entire economy had been retooled for war production. If the factories stopped building tanks and bombers, the Great Depression might come roaring back. Unemployment would spike, the economy would crash. Washington needed a new enemy. Fortunately, the Soviet Union was right there. In 1950, the National Security Council drafted a secret document called NSC 68, needed to maintain a permanent military buildup to contain communism everywhere on the planet. This was the birth of the forever war economy, and it created a self-sustaining loop. The military wants new weapons. Defense contractors like Lockheed and Boeing want fat contracts. Politicians want jobs in their districts so they can get reelected. So the contractors lobby the politicians fund the military buys from the contractors. Everybody gets rich except the taxpayer. This cycle got so out of control that in 1961, President Dwight Eisenhower, a five-star general and war hero, used his farewell address to warn the nation. He said, "We must guard against the military-industrial complex." He was essentially saying, we've created a monster that feeds on conflict. And if we're not careful, it will go looking for wars just to stay fed. But here's the twist. That monster built the modern world. Government poured trillions into research and development. Need to communicate during a nuclear war, the internet. Need precision missile guidance, GPS. Need smaller, faster computers, microchips. Need advanced materials for jets, carbon fiber and plastics. Silicon Valley didn't start with two guys in a garage. It started with massive Department of Defense contracts. Your smartphone exists because the United States wanted to destroy Moscow more efficiently than Moscow could destroy Washington. America didn't just outgun the Soviet Union. It outinvented them using war as an excuse to fund the future. But by 1971, the system started to crack. Remember Bretton Woods, the promise that every dollar was backed by gold at $35 an ounce. Had been printing dollars like crazy to pay for the Vietnam War and the arms race, and other countries started to notice. France looked at the numbers and said, "You guys don't have enough gold to back all this paper." So they demanded to exchange their dollars for physical gold bars. Other countries followed. Gold reserves started draining fast. If it continued, America would go bankrupt. So on August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon went on television and said, "We're not giving you gold anymore." This was the Nixon shock. He unilaterally canceled the convertibility of the dollar to gold. Overnight, the dollar became a fiat currency. It wasn't backed by anything except trust, and trust was evaporating. The value of the dollar started to collapse. Inflation spiked. The American empire looked shaky. Washington needed a new anchor. If the dollar wasn't backed by gold, what could it be backed by? The answer was simple: oil. Treasury sent a team to Saudi Arabia with a proposal. "We will protect you militarily. We'll sell you advanced weapons. We'll defend your oil fields. In exchange, you must do two things. Dollars, treasury bonds, basically loan the money back to us." The Saudis agreed, and because Saudi Arabia was the kingpin of OPEC, the rest of the oil-producing world followed suit. This was the birth of the petrodollar system, and it changed everything. Dollars again, not because of gold, because of energy. If you're Japan and you need oil, you have to buy dollars first. If you're Germany and you need oil, you have to buy dollars first. It meant America could run gigantic budget deficits, print money to pay for wars and welfare programs. And the dollar wouldn't collapse because the world needed it to keep the lights on. Other countries have to balance their budgets. The United States can write checks that never bounce. Because it owns the bank and it owns the gas station. This system has allowed America to live far beyond its means for 50 years. But here's the thing, it only works as long as oil is priced in dollars. And right now, that system is starting to fracture. Now, while the bankers were locking down the oil trade, the United States deployed a weapon the Soviet Union had no defense against. It wasn't a nuclear missile, it wasn't a tank, it was culture. Blue jeans, Coca-Cola, Hollywood, rock and roll. Political scientists call this soft power. It's the ability to get people to want what you want without pointing a gun at them. And America weaponized it better than any empire in history. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union had more tanks. It arguably had better rockets, at least for a while. But life in the USSR looked miserable. Gray concrete, bread lines, terrible shoes, no freedom. Meanwhile, the United States was beaming images across the Iron Curtain: Baywatch, MTV, McDonald's, Levi's 501 jeans. There's a famous story. In the Soviet Union, a pair of American jeans could cost a month's salary on the black market. Why? Because wearing them meant rebellion. It meant freedom. It meant you were cool, you were American. The CIA understood this. They covertly funded jazz tour and art exhibits in Europe to show off American creativity and freedom. The message was clear. Over here, you can be whoever you want. Over there, the state crushes you. In 1990, the first McDonald's opened in Moscow. Thousands of Russians stood in line in the freezing cold for hours. Not because the food was good, because it was a symbol, a taste of the West, a taste of America. By exporting its culture, the United States colonized minds, and that's more powerful than colonizing land. Because before a single American soldier sets foot in your country, your teenagers are already listening to Taylor Swift, watching Marvel movies, and using iPhones. It makes it very hard to hate America when you're addicted to everything it produces. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, and the United States declared total victory, but the game didn't end. The battlefield just moved. It moved into cyberspace, and once again, America got there first. Remember earlier when I said the military invented the internet? In the 1990s, the government handed it over to private companies. And those companies built the digital infrastructure of the entire planet, and almost all of them are American. Search Google social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, business software, Microsoft, smartphones, Apple, cloud computing, Amazon Web Services, streaming, Netflix. These aren't just companies, they are the central nervous system of modern civilization. If you're a business in Germany, you run on Amazon's servers. If you're an influencer in Brazil, you live on Instagram. If you're a government in India, you use Microsoft Office. This gives the United States an intelligence and economic advantage that's almost impossible to quantify. Intelligence agencies have backdoor access to the data flowing through these platforms. They can see everything. Every email, every transaction, every photo, data is the new oil. And just like in 1974, the United States controls the pipelines, so we've established that America has been playing with a stacked deck for 80 years. The land, the money printer, the military, the culture, the internet, it's the most dominant empire in human history. But here's the twist: the house of cards is shaking. Because right now, the United States is facing three existential threats that geography and aircraft carriers can't fix. Threat number one, the debt spiral. Remember the infinite money glitch. The ability to print dollars and buy real things because the world needs your currency. Well, it turns out infinite has a limit. National debt is over $34 trillion. That number is so large the human brain can't process it. But here's the stat that should terrify you. As of 2024, the United States government spends more money on interest payments for its debt than it spends on the entire defense budget, more on old credit card bills than on the military that holds the empire together. If the world ever stops trusting the dollar, that debt becomes a suicide vest strapped to the global economy. Threat number two, weaponizing the dollar is backfiring. In 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine, the United States did something unprecedented. It froze Russia's foreign currency reserves. Hundreds of billions of dollars gone. It kicked Russia out of the SWIFT banking system. It was supposed to be a financial nuclear strike, but it had a side effect. Every other country on Earth, China, India, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, watched that and thought, if we make Washington angry, They can delete our savings overnight. This kicked off a process called de-dollarization. Countries are now actively building alternatives. China and Russia are trading oil in yuan and rubles. Saudi Arabia is talking about pricing oil in currencies other than the dollar, entirely. If the petrodollar dies, if oil stops being priced in dollars, the entire foundation of American financial power collapses. The exorbitant privilege ends, and the United States will have to live within its means for the first time in 50 years. That would be economically catastrophic. And threat number 3, the call is coming from inside the house. The biggest danger to American power isn't in Beijing or Moscow. The political system is more polarized than at any point since the Civil War. A superpower can survive external enemies. It cannot survive when its own government is paralyzed by internal dysfunction. When half the country sees the other half as traitors, when basic governance, passing budgets, maintaining infrastructure, honoring alliances becomes impossible because of ideological gridlock. Empires don't usually get conquered, they collapse from within, and right now, the United States is showing all the warning signs. So let's come back to that number, 50%. In 1945, the United States controlled half of the world's wealth. Today, that number is about 24%, still huge, still dominant, but falling. And here's what nobody wants to admit. That 50% in 1945 wasn't normal. It was a freak accident of history. It only happened because every other industrial power had bombed itself into oblivion. The moment Europe and Asia rebuilt, American dominance was always going to decline. The question was never if, it was how fast, and whether the decline would be managed or chaotic. Right now, it's looking chaotic. Because the entire American system, the dollar, the debt, the military, the alliances, was built on the assumption that the rest of the world would always need us more than we need them. But that assumption is breaking. China is now the largest trading partner for more countries than the United States is. The global south is no longer taking orders from Washington. Even Europe is starting to hedge its bets. The world that America built after World War II, that system of rules and institutions and currencies, is slowly being dismantled. And the tragic irony is that America is dismantling it itself by weaponizing the dollar, by withdrawing from alliances, by treating the global system as a tool of coercion instead of cooperation. So here's the real answer to the question: how did America become a superpower? It had the best geography on the planet. It stayed out of the fight until everyone else was bleeding. It used 2 world wars to become the world's banker and weapons dealer. It rigged the global financial system at Bretton Woods. It locked the world into the petrodollar. It invented the internet and the platforms that run modern life. And it did all of this with ruthless, calculated precision. This wasn't destiny. It wasn't exceptionalism. It was opportunism, strategy, and a willingness to do whatever it took to win. But empires built on opportunism face a harsh reality. The moment the opportunity fades, so does the power. The question isn't how America became a superpower. The real question is what happens when it stops being one. Because that process has already started, and nobody, not Washington, not Beijing, not Brussels, knows how it ends. If you want to understand what comes next, if you want to see the cracks widening in real time, then you need to keep paying attention. Subscribe if you want the unfiltered truth. Hit the like button if you made it this far, and drop a comment. Dollar will lose its reserve status in your lifetime, or is the American system too big to fail? I actually read the ones that sound human. Thanks for watching. And remember, history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And right now, it's starting to sound awfully familiar.